Okay, so today is going to be the last content lecture of the semester online. Next week, I'm going to do a short review to remind you of, the important things, the major things that you need to review for the exam, which is in 2 weeks' time, as you know, on the 10th of June. Today, first of all, I'm going to say we're not going to do chapter 8. We're not going to have enough time to get there. If I want to explain all of the stuff in chapter 7 properly, then it's not going to fit. This happens frequently. I very rarely get to do chapter 8. I think we went at a good pace, fast enough pace, but there's just not room enough to discuss the things in there, which is unfortunate because some of the issues in chapter 8 are very relevant. Just a few days ago, there was a mass shooting in Dallas in an elementary school, which is another tragedy that's a result of lobbying from powerful gun political groups. And I think it would be good to talk about that. But we'll see if we can squeeze a few of those issues in. Guns and international policy and terrorism, nuclear war. These are kind of things that are always in the background in American culture, issues that you don't usually, hopefully you don't have to think about every day, but occasionally they pop up, and they're very serious and significant issues that, that alter American culture and global culture for that matter. So we'll see if we can talk about a couple of those issues at the end, but for the most part, we're just going to keep chapter 8 off the exam, and we'll just discuss some of that on Friday at the end of class when I conclude chapter 7. So the objective for today is pretty simple. I'm going to explain the middle of chapter 7, which is starts on page 226. No, starts on 225, and it goes through to there's a few interruptions with the Winston Churchill stuff, but I'll deal with that on Friday as well. There's a contradiction stuff we talked about already, but it largely goes straight through to the neocons and the bipartisan consensus. So it's the page numbers are 225 to 239. So this lecture is based on those pages in the textbook, and you should read them over. There's a couple interruptions because of World War II. World War II happens right in here, so don't get confused. There's 5 major periods. This is the way that one of the contributors to the Cambridge Companion to American Culture, he organized the 20th century like this. Okay, so this influenced me, and this idea is not originally mine. A scholar decided to divide the 20th century this way, and I thought it was an easy way for people to get a sense of the periods of what American culture was like at different times during the 20th century. So I use this as my model, and all the bibliographical, all the references are at the back of the textbook if you care to see where this information comes from. Of course, we have to give credit where credit is due. I'm going to add my own take on each period. I'm not going to read exactly what the famous professor wrote, but I'll try and interpret some of the things that he said for you. So the 20th century, really, we've talked about World War I now and how transformative that was. And the early 20th century for the United States was, you can call it like the coming out party of the United States. America was recognized as a powerful emerging country but not on the same level as the British or the French or the Germans or the Russians, but an emerging power. And they won the Spanish-American War, and their military still wasn't as developed or as powerful or as numerous as those other countries. But by the time World War I is over, America is on the same level as these other great nations and starting to exceed them. As I said, one of the things that happens in the 1890s, there's a severe depression. So in addition to that conflict with Spain, which sort of turns the United States outward looking, expanding beyond their borders, the frontier closes. There's an economic crisis, deep depression. Before the Great Depression in the 1930s, the 1890s, that was the Great Depression. Sort of the same way World War I was called the Great War, until they had another war that was even worse. And then they called it World War II. But anyway, there was a very severe depression. A lot of people lost money and jobs. A lot of businesses went bankrupt in the 1890s. They had the war with Spain. They won it. In the early 1900s, it appeared like America, asserting itself on the world stage, and the economy started to pick up. And then World War I happened, which was a disaster, of course. But for the Americans, there was kind of a self-interested reason for not participating, right? There's multiple reasons why they didn't step in. Some of them is that there was a lot of Germans in America. People don't realize there were millions of German people of German descent. There were dozens of German newspapers in the United States. So there was a portion of the population that didn't really want to fight against Germany, right? This is not Nazi Germany. This is not World War II. This is Imperial Germany. So you got Imperial, you got the French Republic, you got the British Empire, and you got the German Empire. And there's not really, for many citizens, there's not really any reason to get in on either side because there's ethnic connections. There's a lot of Irish people in America too, and Irish people don't really want to help the British Empire either because they're trying to get independence. We talked about Ireland before. Ireland is sort of the original, annexed territory dominated by the English for hundreds and hundreds of years. They're just like Korea was trying to throw off the chains of Japanese imperialism. The Irish were also trying to gain their own independence and self-determination. So the Irish Americans were not really anti-German. They did not want to support the British Empire in many cases because they were sympathetic with Ireland, and the British Empire was still controlling Ireland. So logically, if the British Empire lost, then Ireland would be free, they assumed. So it's a very complicated situation where there's a lot of people from different backgrounds, and to intervene on the side of the British and the French wasn't a simple thing. Again, also because George Washington and Monroe, except for the Spanish-American War, largely they've stayed neutral and stayed out of European wars. So to break that precedent was going to be difficult and politically not supportable, basically, until, as we talked about in class on Friday, a French student actually asked, why did the Germans, I don't understand why the Germans started attacking the shipping lines with the submarines. Wasn't that a stupid thing to do? It was a stupid thing. It turned out to be the worst thing, because didn't they want to keep America out of the war? Of course they did. But Germany was in sort of when they made the decision, they were still fighting Russia on one side, France and Great Britain on the other. And what they were trying to do was cut off Great Britain from their supplies. And if the submarine warfare, they were sinking like 1,000 ships a month. If they kept up that pace, if they were able to sink that many ships, Britain would have to drop out of the war because they would run out of food, supplies, and money. So the they decided to increase that to try and knock Great Britain out of the war so that they could focus on France. Instead, though, what they ended up doing is sinking American shipping as well, causing America to declare war because of their actions. They said it was illegal actions, as I explained. They sank the Lusitania, was one of the main events. It was a passenger ship that was hiding military equipment, but it was full of hundreds of American citizens. So this caused the public outrage that gave the president, Woodrow Wilson, the ability to declare war. So it was a terrible mistake, especially because right after that, Russia surrendered. They had their communist revolution, the Tsar was deposed, and they wanted out of the war, so they sued for peace. So all of a sudden, Germany could have been fighting the British and the French alone, but now they're fighting the Americans too, and that was a disaster. Another thing is, they tried to get Mexico. Some people don't know about this. It's called the Zimmerman telegram. And this was a huge mistake too, because the Germans, this guy named Zimmerman, foreign secretary in Germany, he sent a telegram to Mexico suggesting that they ally with Germany, and if the United States jumped in on the British and American side, that Germany would ally with Mexico, and Mexico could attack America and perhaps get some of the land back that they lost in the 19th century. That was not a great plan because Mexico didn't have the military capacity to do that, and the British were tapping, of course, those telegraph lines. You're not supposed to intercept them. It was also illegal to intercept messages, but the British, of course, their intelligence service is world famous. They have like the best intelligence service in the world. They intercepted the telegram, and they were not, because of international law, they were not supposed to be listening to the Germans' telegrams, but they did illegally, and so they had a problem. How can we tell the Americans that we stole a message that we weren't supposed to listen to, but we know that it contains information about Mexico that would cause the United States again to be more favorable to fighting with the British and the French to join the alliance. So they just decided that they would just give it to them. Here, we found this somewhere. Take a look at it. And they gave the Zimmerman telegram to Woodrow Wilson, and that gave them another reason. They're trying to get Mexico to backstab them. They sink a whole bunch of American ships, especially a passenger ship with hundreds of American citizens. And Woodrow Wilson was a kind of Anglo-centric person anyway. He was kind of he didn't want to enter the war because it was politically unpopular, but he did support Britain, and he was, in favor of fighting on the side of the British against the Germans anyway. So as soon as those reasons made it politically possible for the Americans to participate, they did. But it was very late in the war, right in the last year, that they finally arrived and overwhelmed the Germans. So for most of the war, they didn't have to suffer any human losses. There was no territory that changed hands. America's land and territory never got attacked except for their ships by submarines. But there was no damage to American possessions at all. So they got all the economic benefit, like I said. This made an economic boom. So 1918, right, the end of there's a Spanish flu. So it's not all optimism, it's not all positive energy or anything, but World War I, by the end of 1918, World War I is over. Victory. We have a terrible pandemic. Many people die. Thousands of people die. But in the 1920s, we call these the Roaring 20s, because that's where the real optimism kicks in. We've gone through all these things. We've participated in a war. We saved Europe, right? We survived a global pandemic. People were sick and died, but now we've recovered. And now everything's going great. Business is booming. Everybody's, this is when Henry Ford starts making tons of cars, and Americans are driving cars, and roads are being built, and cities are being built. Stock market is growing crazily. People are dancing and swinging, having a good time. And this like, it's kind of over optimistic, this sense that everything's going really great in America continues throughout the 20s. But by the end of the 1920s, there's some serious problems happening. People have overinvested. People have speculated in land. People have borrowed money to buy stocks because the stocks go up so much that they borrow money from the bank, and they say, okay, I'll borrow money from the bank at 5% and my stock will go up 25%. So people are, borrowing credit is overextended. There's problems with agriculture. Farmers are having problems, making money. Some farmers their businesses, they're going bankrupt because of oversupply of food, believe it or not, things like that. So it's problems in the agricultural sector where the agricultural sector is not sustaining itself. It's starting to have fundamental structural problems where they're not making enough money. When you have so much, this is actually a chronic problem, believe it or not. We do have world hunger and everything, but in the United States, it has the largest food production in the world. And in the United States, one of the problems has been overproduction of food. Like if you're a farmer and everybody grows corn or everybody grows wheat, and you just have billions of tons of grain, then the price is going to be really small. So that's why if you go to, you look at farms in Korea and they're, 100 pyong or 200 pyong or whatever, and you go to the United States and they're like literally sometimes 1 million or 10 million pyong. It's just these farms are enormous, and they use machines, and the way that they make money is just by mass producing huge amounts. So you can't have a small farm unless you're going to grow like some heirloom tomatoes or like exotic fruit or some expensive, very expensive market garden commodity. But in general, it's a bread basket. It's producing staple food. In America, they grow rice, they grow corn, they grow barley, they grow wheat, and they produce tons of it. So this is happening in the countryside first, and then it starts to put pressure on banks, and the banks have already lent too much money. And some of these businesses, people, just like any time there's a bubble, people are investing too much money, and some of these companies start to fail. They say they're going to be great companies, they're going to do great things, but they don't. And when they don't, the stock drops and people lose money. So these things start happening more and more, and then it's almost like a chain reaction goes through the whole system. And part of the reason is because while there's optimism here in America, in Germany, there's a severe economic depression as a result of their loss of the war and the punishments. The economy in Germany can't recover because of the sanctions and the payments they have to make because of the Treaty of Versailles to France, and their economy is crippled. Their military is restricted, and they're unable to recover because of the terms of the treaty. This obviously prevents Germany from growing, but it has a kind of knock-on effect to all the European countries, because Germany is still the most populous, most economically significant part of Europe. So when you have, just like the EU now, it's Germany and France, if their economies are doing well, they kind of pull along all the other economies. If the German and French economies start to shrink, it pulls the rest of the smaller economies, get pulled down by them. So it turned out to be a very big economic mistake, because that's what happened. There started to be, recessions in France and Great Britain, because they were also unable to recover after the war. They had huge amounts of debt. They had huge amounts of damage to do. They had to recover, they had to rebuild. Everything was destroyed, and they were trying to rebuild everything. And they still had empires to manage. They had colonies and territories all over the world. and they just didn't have enough resources to do it. So Europe starts to fall into a recession and then fall into a depression. And the London Stock Exchange crashes first, and then in 1929, and then the New York Stock Exchange, the infamous stock exchange crash of 1929, Black Monday and Black Tuesday, where in a couple days, 20% of all value of the stocks disappears, and it's just it's stocks. So it's just people sell stocks and people freak out, and more people sell, and then all of a sudden it just vanishes, and all your money is gone. And if you were borrowing money and you put your life savings into that and you hadn't saved anything, you're in huge trouble. And a lot of people did that, right? So people go to the banks and they want to withdraw their money and everything, everybody at the same time. So this is called a bank run. It happened in Russia at the beginning of the Ukrainian war, when the Western sanctions blocked the banks, Russian banks, from the international system. Russians ran to the banks and tried to take out all their money because they were afraid they weren't going to be able to access it. So this is called a bank run. People go into the banks, but the banks had no money. Literally, some banks just shut their door and went out of business, and people who were using those banks, because there were hundreds of banks in the United States, private banks as well, they just lost their bank account, just disappeared. It's gone. So then businesses started shrinking, businesses started losing money. Nobody would lend any money because it was unsafe. So all businesses usually borrow money to function. So there was many banks collapsed, many businesses went out of business, and this is the beginning of the Great Depression. You end up having somewhere between 25 and 30% of Americans without a job. So you have 1 in 3 Americans out of work, which is an extreme number. So that's the end. Nobody's optimistic. Everybody's pessimistic once you get here. As I said before, this is where FDR comes in, and he proposes this thing called a New Deal. And he tries to rejuvenate the American economy by public works programs and by new programs, education and infrastructure and construction and government-run organizations. And to a certain extent, it mitigates the damage, but it doesn't solve the problem. The Depression doesn't get solved until World War II, right? Until World War II starts. And really for the Americans, it's 1942 when they really start participating. But they're already ramping up the military spending and the investment and the development and the technology and the manufacturing and the industry and the jobs just explode. And you go from 25% unemployment to zero, literally zero. And in order for the Americans to solve their economic problems, fight a war against Germany and Japan at the same time, and help all their allies with equipment and everything, they were sending money and equipment to the United Kingdom from 1940. Their economy was already getting going because they were helping the allies, especially Great Britain, but also Russia, sending them equipment and money. And in order to do that, they needed to have a political agreement, right? And the Democrats were in control of the presidency, but it was a national emergency. So as any good person or a political system should do, you set aside your differences and you get a consensus between different parties. People have different point of views, but right now, let's just do what we can for survival, right? To make this work. So, led by the liberal FDR and then Truman after that. But even when the Republican takes over, Eisenhower becomes Republican president for 2 terms. After that, he continues the policy of sort of a balanced liberal approach to the economy and to international affairs. So they win World War II, and the liberal consensus survives for about 20 years, and that is we call the people that are born in the 1920s and experienced the Great Depression and then fought in World War II, the young people. So we're talking about the people who were born at the end of World War I and into the 1920s, the people who were in their 20s in the 1940s. That's called the greatest generation. Right? They are the children of the Americans who fought in World War I, and they endured the hardship between the two wars, and then they participated in the recovery of the economy in America as they went into World War II, and then they won World War II against the Axis, the Japanese, Italians, and the Germans. So that's called the greatest generation, because they by the end of World War II, there's really only one real superpower. Russia is still powerful, but America is clearly dominant over most of the world. The Cold War occurs because Russia challenges that, but basically you have an American country that becomes the most powerful country that ever existed in the history of human beings. They are a superpower on a different level than the British or the Romans or the Chinese or anybody else. They have atomic weapons. They have 15 million people in their military. They have ships and bases all over the world. They single-handedly basically defeat the Japanese with the help of the Chinese on the mainland. And they dominate the Western theater, although the Russians were the main. Obviously, the Russians were the ones who were responsible for the defeat of Germany, but the Americans led the attack on the West. So this is the greatest generation. The economy is white hot, what we call a white hot economy. You don't see that much anymore, but the American economy was growing 10% year on year for 20 years. So you're talking about like the size of the United States economy is doubling like every 5 years. China did this kind of growth in the late 20th century. Chinese GDP was growing by like 10%. They also had their period, in the I guess it would have been the 1990s to early 2000s. They had like a decade of extreme economic growth. That's what America did after World War II. So everything was going well, except that basically fundamentally there was a lot of inequality that remained in American society. For example, some of the men of the greatest generation were black, right? And in the army, the white units and the black units were separate. Asian units were separate. If you were fighting, like you would be in a unit, it would be only black guys. It'd be only African American guys. So there's segregation in the army, right? There's segregation in schools still. And so this is what happens. They fight in World War II. They sacrifice themselves just like everybody else. They're American citizens. Only difference is they have a different skin color. And they come back and then they get treated. Why are they fighting? Why are they fighting? They're fighting for America. They're fighting for American values. What are American values? Remember the contradictions? That we're supposed to be free, right? We're fighting for freedom. We're fighting to protect France or recover France and protect Great Britain and stop a crazy man who's trying to he's a racist killer who's trying to, be the dictator of the world. We're trying to get rid of that guy. And we win. Hitler's dead and gone. The Japanese empire collapses. China's, free to fight itself to figure out what its destiny is going to be. And all the nations of the world are supposed to be, making their own decisions about how they're going to develop, right? And so these are principles that you're fighting for, not just like they're not fighting to protect America, except for in the case of the Japanese, but they're still, they're still across the ocean. So it's a retaliation, and it's to prevent is to promote the values and to protect the values that Americans believe in. You come back home and you're a second-class citizen. You have to sit at the back of the bus. You know, you fought just as bravely as any of the other soldiers for your values and for your country. And then you're not allowed to play professional baseball, and you're not allowed to sit on you have to use a different washroom. You have to go to a different school. You get discriminated against when you go to work. So this is bound to happen when you have if you have this unbalance between people in your society, and they contribute in every other way, but they're not given the same treatment. That's fundamentally unfair, and that results in the end of the liberal consensus, and then the civil rights movement, which you all know. Martin Luther King Jr. Was a famous figure who made speeches. He was a reverend, and he made these beautiful speeches, master of rhetoric, about peace and brotherhood and equality and opportunity. I have a dream is his famous speech, right? And this was all due to the fact that there was still discrimination, segregation in the society, and that was fundamentally unfair. So there was a whole bunch of court cases, and there was protests, and there was rioting and fighting, and there was violence. And in the end, the civil rights movement accomplished many of their goals, and there was reform in the late 1960s, mostly under Lyndon Johnson. They reformed the law to abolish segregation in schools, military, other places. So people were actually equal, and they had access to the same public space. There's women's rights and gay rights and native rights and other things. So it was focused mostly around war protesting, various kinds of minority groups, African American and other kinds of groups. The African Americans were largely the leaders, but there was a lot of women participating. And as you know, there's discrimination continues to be a problem, but the civil rights movement made it illegal. So there was a process to try and fix the discrimination that shouldn't be happening. Right now, some of these things are under threat. Some people in America, some conservatives are trying to kind of roll back some of these progressive ideas, but this period was a crisis, right? Just like the Depression was, this was a social problem, a cultural difficulty that the Americans had to overcome. So the reaction to that was a new stability starting in the 1980s. And I mentioned Ronald Reagan. He has some good points, but largely I'm not a fan of Ronald Reagan for a variety of reasons. One of them is because the neoconservative movement is really hawkish. They're really supportive of military action, military intervention. As one of our students mentioned, he didn't like any of the presidents because they've all, to some extent or another, participated in some sort of military action, some sort of war, and this is true. So, but there are worse presidents and there are better presidents. Some presidents try to avoid conflict. Some of them interfere in intervene and interfere in other arenas. But Ronald Reagan wanted to end the Cold War. One of the things he did is put a lot of pressure on Russia, and ultimately that succeeded, and the Soviet Union collapsed. And but his strategy for reducing spending and what we call Reaganomics, like just allowing the market to run its course and deregulating all of the economic policies and financial policies of the government, really had a detrimental effect. America doesn't have health care. It doesn't have public health care of any kind. It's totally private. Almost all developed countries have some form of health care as a basic right, as a basic service that all people have access to. The United States does not. And that's one of the things that Canadians, myself, I'm Canadian, as you know, this is one of the first things that people say, I want to live in Canada because of the healthcare system. We know it's slow. We know it's hard to see a doctor unless your leg is broken or you have a heart attack. Then you get to see a doctor right away, don't worry. But if you're in some pain, the system isn't designed to be, it's not designed to be expensive, and it's not designed to be super efficient and fast, right? That's because every single person has equal access. Just because you're a rich guy, unless you're the prime minister or, you have some sort of special role in the government, perhaps you'll get preferential treatment. But for the rest of us, you don't go to an expensive hospital or a cheap hospital. You just go and get free treatment if you need it. If you have cancer, you get treatment for cancer. If you don't, you don't. If you have a cold, it's not that bad. You don't go to the doctor because you're just putting a undue strain on the system. So since basically all developed countries think that health is an important thing to support, and other things like maternity leave, like America doesn't have maternity leave. In Canada, if you have a baby and you're a woman, you can leave your job for a year. You get paid. They can't fire you. It's illegal. The United States, there's nothing. If you have a baby, they can just fire you. They don't support. They don't believe in social services, partly because this neoconservative movement has emphasized shrinking of the government, reducing taxes, especially for rich people though. But overall, people like paying less taxes. But if you pay less taxes, you have less services. For example, unemployment insurance, pensions, healthcare. These are things that are very beneficial for the well-being and the health of your entire society. But these people do not believe those. They believe those programs are a waste of time, and so it emphasizes people who are successful and rich. But what if you're not? There are millions of Americans who struggle, and the social safety net is very weak. That's the end of the 20th century, and it says in the textbook the expression was coined by Henry Luce, the founder of Time magazine. He didn't say it until the middle of World War II, that this is the American century. But by that point, he was looking back to the early 20th century, and he could see that America had become a cultural force that was dominant and important for the entire world. So that's why he coined that phrase. So that's the title for the last online lecture that I'm going to give you. Right at the bottom there, I wrote the New World Order because that's in chapter 8, because we do have a different environment right now. Obviously, we don't know how things are going in Russia right now, but China has grown significantly, and this century certainly is not going to be called the American century. As much as they would like to continue to dominate the world, it's not like that anymore. The world is going to have to change, and China and India and Brazil and all countries that are developing and getting stronger, people are catching up. Because America was so far ahead in the middle of the 20th century that there was no dispute. But there's a number of countries that are becoming more important, more significant, and there's going to have to be a new balance. So what is the New World Order? Well, George Bush actually said this, and what he meant was that America was going to continue to dominate, right? But what I think is more likely to happen is that either the United States is going to start to negotiate and partner more with other countries, strengthen alliances, or they're going to be challenged. And if they're challenged in the wrong way, there's going to be really, like already, we don't want to have confrontations between these, really powerful cultures, nations, regions. Otherwise, we're going to end up with another world war. And as I explained to you, that it was a complete disaster both times. And since then, we've been lucky, fortunate enough not to see anything like that. And certainly none of us want to see that again. So reshuffling after this new world order idea starts to get pushed to the side. Maybe we'll be able to talk about something like some sort of global partnership where rather than being some sort of conflict between major powers, we can have more like some sort of collaboration, a global partnership between the major powers. If somehow China and America could, make some sort of agreement or alliance with each other, those two countries could lead the world. If they could just shake hands and say, okay, we're going to work on this together. We're going to tackle climate change. We're going to build a stable economic system. We're going to fight poverty. We're going to distribute medicine to all the countries in the world and not be I know I'm not saying China or America's bad or good, but they're very self-interested. When America goes places, it does things, and there's things coming back, self-interest. They invest, and then things come back. They do things for other countries, and they expect something in return. And if there was more of a balance and more of a sort of interest in the future of the earth, rather than just America being the best or China being stronger, if they could somehow agree that we have certain things that all of us need to focus on, like I said, climate change, poverty, disease, right? These kind of things, stable territorial agreements, right? If they could work on those projects rather than just arguing about, who is going to win the economic battles or who is going to have more influence over this area of the world, that we would see some progress. I think the United Nations is kind of a hard system to be effective. The United Nations is just a group of nations really just discussing things and getting donations from countries so they can make things happen. United Nations was created after World War II. There was a previous one after World War I called the League of Nations, which failed. The reason it failed is because it didn't have very good leadership and the United States didn't participate. So like the EU, you have Germany and France leading the way, and basically everybody defers to them. If we had some kind of global leadership that involved China and the United States as the leaders that were cooperating with each other, sort of the way France and Germany usually do. They disagree, but they collaborate. We might see some sort of improvement, because otherwise I think the 21st century is going to be a bit of a disaster. I'm not expecting the climate to fix itself. So, these issues are very serious, and that I'm hoping that American culture will allow itself to be flexible in order to change in the next decade. Otherwise, if we don't have good leadership from the major cultures in the world, then the rest of us are going to suffer as well. So that's the end of the description. This is kind of a map. Make sure you check this out, read about it in the book, and take your screenshot of this board, because that'll definitely be an important part of the exam. On Friday, we will finish the chapter by talking about a few different aspects of American culture, especially the movie industry, especially Hollywood, American cinema, Hollywood. But we'll mention a few other parts of American culture as well, if we can fit it in. So see you for the last class on Friday, and make sure you write your paper and submit it by Friday as well. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you for the review one last time in a week.